Wolfman was disappointing to say the least, but we still have to talk about it. So I'm going to tell you why, at least in my opinion, I thought this movie turned out pretty disappointing. But before we get started, if you're new here, my name is Erin, and I talk all things movies and TV, but really mostly movies. So if you're into that sort of thing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for me. That would be greatly appreciated on my end. But without further ado, let's talk about Wolfman. So in this, we follow a man and his family as he takes them to his childhood family farm out in the woods. And when they get attacked by an unseen animal, our main character Blake, who is played by Christopher Abbott, begins to change into, well, a wolf. Jumping right into the good, and the first thing I have here is just the horror elements of this film. They did a really good job at the physical horror in this thing. There was a lot of it, and it will probably make you squirm at times as well. There was just lots of blood, some limbs being lost, and really just a lot of imagery overall that just makes you feel a bit uncomfortable and kind of just makes you go, ugh, when you see it, if you know what I mean. Another thing I thought they did really well at least in the first half of this film, is not showing the monster, or at least in this case, the wolfman that was chasing them. And this is a pretty common trope amongst all horror movies, where you don't show your monster or wait as long as you possibly can to reveal what your monster actually looks like, because then that allows the audience to kind of formulate ideas of what the monster looks like in their mind, and that in turn builds more suspense and kind of makes it more scary in a sense, because as humans we fear the unknown. The best example of this, in my opinion, is Jaws. I mean, we don't see the shark in its full entirety until like the very end of that film, and I know that movie isn't necessarily a horror film, but it is that same concept where your mind has to make up what this monster looks like in your head, and that inherently adds and creates a sense of fear to everything in that movie. I mean, just think, if they would have revealed Jaws very early in that movie, do you think it would have worked as well as it did? Anyways, this isn't a review on Jaws, it's a review on Wolfman, but maybe one day I do revisit Jaws and review that movie, because in my opinion, it is a classic. But for this movie, Wolfman, I guess what I am trying to say is that they did a good job executing that trope of not showing the monster in the first half of the movie. Finally, for the horror elements, I have to say they did a pretty good job at sound editing this thing, because there were plenty of moments in this film where it just felt deathly silent and you could hear every little thing that was going on, and that kind of puts you on the edge of your seat because you knew that a jump scare was coming, but you just didn't know when it was going to happen. It's definitely one of those it's quiet, almost too quiet type of things. So even though I am kind of indifferent about this movie, in terms of the horror elements, I do think they did a really good job. Next up for the good is the practical effects, and the one thing I'm really more talking about here is the prosthetics that they used for the wolf makeup. It looked really good, and that was also another thing that added to the physical horror of this movie. We saw him change over time in this movie, so every time we saw him, he looked different, and they had added a new prosthetic or a new feature to show him changing into a wolf, and I thought that was pretty cool. Plus, there was also some really creative camera movements that they used to show the perspectives of our different characters. Essentially, they would use like this orbiting movement to kind of cycle through our characters and show their perspectives. So they would start behind one character and kind of orbit over to the other one, and you would end up behind them and you would see their perspective on things. And they used this a lot when our main character Blake was turning into a wolf, because they would show what he was seeing as a wolf and what his senses were now like, now that he is kind of more changing into that wolf and becoming less man. And I just thought that was really cool, because I had never seen someone display perspective like that in a movie before. Moving on to the so-so, and the only thing I have here is that this movie just overall felt half-baked. They introduced a lot of ideas and good themes, but at the end of the day, just didn't do much with them. There were themes of generational trauma and not passing that down to your children, and I thought that was a really cool theme to introduce in this movie. I thought they were gonna do something really cool with that, but again, they just didn't really dig into that at all, and that's what made this movie feel kind of empty for me. It also felt like they were trying to explore something with our main couple's relationship, but that didn't go anywhere either. So long story short, I guess what I'm trying to say is, with them doing all of this and introducing these themes and ideas, but not really exploring them at all, it just made this entire movie feel flat for me. And then on top of that, it also made our characters feel paper thin, because we really didn't go into depth on any of them. Moving on to the bad, and the first thing I have here is that this movie was extremely predictable. In my opinion, opinion at least, in the first like 10 to 15 minutes of this movie, I knew exactly how this thing was probably going to turn out. Essentially, there was this piece of information that was revealed, and once I heard this piece of information, I was like, oh, I think I kind of know how this is going to end. And then we got to the end of the movie, and it turned out what I thought was exactly right. So when we get to what was supposed to be these big reveals, you just didn't really care because you had a sense that that was going to happen. And that kind of made this movie feel like there was no real stakes, which kind of brings me back to why this movie kind of just feels flat overall to me. And finally, for the bad, and this just may be a me thing, but I just kind of wish we got a little bit more lore on this whole Wolfman thing. As far as we know, I guess this is a disease, and if you get scratched or something by a Wolfman, then you turn into one. And I just wish there was more behind that. Like, is there a way to stop one from turning? Or once they do turn, what are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? Is there a certain way to kill these things, and can it come back to life? So it was just little things like that that I wish they would have added to the character or just entity of the Wolfman that, at least in my opinion, I think would have added more intrigue to the story overall. So overall, this is a movie that will end up being pretty forgettable in my opinion. It's got some good horror elements, but with a half-baked plot and one-dimensional characters, it just fell flat for me. Those are my thoughts on Wolfman. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie down in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, get your Eazy Apparel at shopeasyapparel.com. God bless, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.